Good day everyone. So here we have again a new lesson which is about historical and reader response approaches to literature. So we already discussed 4 and now we have the 5th and the 6th literary approaches in critiquing a literary piece. So before we continue, let's read this definition. So literature is a form of art. While all arts have critics, we must learn to critique a literature to help us solve problems that we encounter in reading, to help us examine the literary piece and make sense out of it, and to help us experience world other than ours. So of course, everything in life, there will always be critics. There will always be bashers. But when we say you are critiquing someone, it does not mean something negative. So we, readers, must also learn to become critics in order for us to be able to examine a literary piece and understand it much more or much deeper, as well as to help us experience things that may not be part of this world, or things or experiences that we may not be able to experience in our lifetimes. So once again, the 2 literary approaches that we're going to talk about for today is the historical and the reader response approaches. Yeah. So while there are many ways to examine and critique a written work, the historical approach is one of the oldest approaches. This approach tries to look at what is happening to the world when the literature was written, to know if the author knowingly or unknowingly incorporated outside forces in the literary work. There are 2 most common historical approaches, which are the naturalist and the social Dwarvenism. So, among the 6 approaches, or among the 4 approaches that we have already discussed, the historical approach is considered as one of the oldest. And from the word history itself, so it's about the past. So here, we are trying to understand the world that the author lived in while he was still writing the literary piece. In order for us to understand whether or not did the author consciously or unconsciously put in some elements of the story which are also part of the real world, which are also part of the outside forces. So there are 2 main common approaches, which is naturalism and social Darwinism. But basically, this is the definition of the historical approach. So looking at history itself, what did the author did, what were the things, what were the conditions during the time during the time the author was still writing the literary piece. So we're going to analyze that and connect it to the literary piece that we are critiquing. So did the hardships during the time, did the language used during the time affected the literary piece? For example, medieval ages, the works of William Shakespeare, Old English texts. So we can easily identify that the William Shakespeare's masterpieces or plays were affected of his time, of his era, because with the use of the Old English language. So let's look at what do we mean by naturalism or realism. So it's a literary movement during the 1880s to the 1930s, where detailed realism is used to indicate that social conditions, heredity, and environment had forces that are not escapable in molding the human character. From the world, natural and real, naturalism or realism examines the accurate, detailed, and plain image of nature or life when the literary work was written. Okay. So according to naturalism and realism, so we look at the social conditions, the author's heredity, the author's environment during his character creations in his story. And we, the critics, using naturalism, analyzes or examines how accurate, how detailed, and how plain is the image of life or of nature in the literary work presented or written by the author. So did the author wrote a lush green forest, a fertile land, and in the present, there is no more lush green forest. It has been cut down. So we examine it as readers. Oh, so during this time or during in the past, so this was the social conditions or this was the environment that the author lived in. Now also critiquing. So is the way that the author describe the forest, the jungle, really accurate? Did the author use words such as moist, rough terrain, and so on and so forth, or did he use words that should not be used in describing life or nature? For example, metallic, autonomous, and so on and so forth. So meanwhile, we have the second one, social Dwarvenism. So it is a 19th century movement influenced by Charles Darwin's idea of the theory of evolution. This approach believes in the saying, survival of the fittest. So the strong shall live, the weak shall die. The idea that some people become powerful in society because they are naturally born better. So social Darwinism is an extension of Darwinism to social phenomena. Specifically, a sociological theory that sociocultural advance is the product of intergroup conflict and competition. And the socially elite classes possesses biological superiority in the struggle for existence. It is a theory that persons, groups, and races are subject to the same laws of natural selection as Charles Darwin had proposed for plants and animals in nature. So social Darwinists such as Herbert Spencer and Walter Bagehot in England, as well as William Graham Sumner in the USA, held that life of humans in society was a struggle for existence ruled by survival of the fittest. In Spencer's words, wealth was said to be a sign of natural superiority. Its absence, a sign of unfitness. The theory was used from the late 19th century to support laissez-faire capitalism and political conservatism. Social Darwinism declined as scientific knowledge explained. So how can we relate this in literature? So social Darwinism, we can relate it as a historical approach in critiquing a literary piece by knowing that it is an approach that believes in saying survival of the fittest. The idea that some people become powerful in society because they are naturally born better. So, how can we relate? We can relate this by asking the question, there are so many authors, there are so many stories, poems in the world, and why were these why were some of the literary pieces endured? while the others also fade away. So we can connect this theory or this approach as sub-approach. This is still under historical approach naman. Ano? So it's under. So sub-approach, and say that maybe because the author was in a much better position. The author was someone with at least a small amount of wealth, or the author was not a poor man. Ano? Because if the author was a poor man, let's say a beggar, or let's say a sales vendor only, ano? So, would he or she be able to have some time to write a literary piece? And would she be able to have, or would he be able to have the means, the money, the connections for it to be published? Ano? Another example, again, let's use our national hero, Jose Rizal. Jose Rizal was an author. He was able to write and publish the No Limitang Here and El Filibusterismo. How? Or, yes, how was he able? Because he was not a poor man. He was from a middle class to a bit upper class family. So, he was from a, let's say, rich class, rich family. Why? Because he was able to study during the Spanish era, mind you, so he was an educated Filipino during a time that we were conquered by Spaniards. He was also able to study abroad in other countries. And even though he was exiled to another country, he was still, or he had still some money. He was still being able to support himself. To the point that he was not just only able to live, but also publish his works. Yes, sir, but there was a deleted chapter. Yes, that is because he was short of funds. Meaning, he almost spent all of his money. But still, he still had enough money to publish two separate books or two separate stories. Meaning to say, he had the means, or he was still middle up to a rich class. He was still not a poor man. So, survival of the fittest. Maybe there were many other great stories, poems, folk tales of the past that were deleted or that were forgotten just because of simple reasons that they were not published, or maybe they were published but they only had a few limited copies. Because why are they only limited? Because of course the author only had a few money, or had a small amount of resources in order to publish his or her works. Yan. So, next is our second approach, the reader response approach. So, from the name itself, reader response. So, the response, the reactions of us, the readers. So, it focuses on the reader or audience of the literature and their interpretation and meaning-making of the text based on their experience of the literary work. It believes that literature does not solely interpret themselves, but readers help in shaping the meaning of the literature from person to person and from time to time. The reader's interpretation of the literary work is influenced by his or her background, education, exposure, experiences, moral values, personal beliefs, opinions, taste, perspective in life, and the like. Therefore, everyone's reaction to the text is unique. So, in our last approach, the reader response approach, this is a somewhat subjective. The reason is because we are all unique and we are all different. And according to this approach, our ability to critique a certain text will have its unique way because each one of us have our own different experiences. For example, you are a rich man or you are the son or the daughter of a rich family. Your father, your mother are always making $10 billion in a day and you are able to live a good life. So you may have a different interpretation, a different moral lesson, a different values and ethics that you gained from the stories no Limetangere and El Filibusterismo than me, who, for example, I was a poor man, I was an adopted boy only, and adopted by a poor family only, So, I may have different life experiences that I can relate or that experiences can give me a new point of view that you did not look or you did not notice in the story Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. So that is the reader response approach. So just additional information, So I have here searched some more information internet. What is historical criticism and reader response criticism? So once again, historical criticism. So literary criticism in the light of historical evidence or based on the text on the context in which a work was written, including facts about the author's life and the historical and social circumstances of the time. Also known as the historical critical method or higher criticism, is a branch of criticism that investigates the origins of ancient texts in order to understand the world behind the text. So it is a branch of criticism that investigates the origins. Where did this literary piece came from? Did this came from medieval times? Did it came from ancient Mesopotamia? Did it came from 10 years ago? Did it came from yesterday? In order for us, the readers, to understand the world written in the text. Is the world written in the text a science fiction? There are jetpacks, flying cars, and so on and so forth. Why did the writer wrote that text? So let's look at the past. So was it during the 1970s, the 1980s, during the technological revolution? So was the author daydreaming that this will be the future, and so on and so forth? So we will be examining information such as facts about the life of the author, historical and social circumstances of the time. Meaning, not just the author, but also the environment, the government of the time, or the era. So while it is often discussed in terms of Jewish and Christian writings from ancient times, historical criticism has also been applied to other religious writings from various parts of the world and periods of history. So, where do we usually or in what kinds of literary pieces is historical criticism often used? So, of course, in religious writings because they are really written from the past, and is still being studied, still being learned up to now. Yeah, okay. So that would be the only additional information for historical criticism. Next is reader response criticism. Yeah. So again, it is a subjective. So let's first identify subjective versus objective. So when we refer to something as subjective, we mean that it pertains to the individual or us, the readers. A subjective reading of a text is one in which emphasis is placed on the attitudes, moods, and opinions of the reader. When we refer to something as objective, we mean that it pertains to an object, the text, separate from the individual or the reader. An objective reading of a text is one that is uninfluenced by emotions or personal prejudice. So, reader response criticism offers a subjective or egocentric reading of a text. Egocentric refers to anything that regards the self of the individual as the center of all things. So, here we can easily identify that subjective is connected to reader response. And when we say subjective, it means that it is affected by our moods, attitudes, opinions, experiences of the reader. So, reader response critics believe that a reader's interaction with the text gives the text its meaning. The text cannot exist without the reader. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a noise? If a text sits on a shelf in a bookstore and no one is around to read it, does the text have meaning? So according to this, a text will only give a moral lesson once it has been read by a reader. Because no matter how good a certain text is, if no one reads it, therefore no one will be able to gain knowledge, to gain moral lessons, or to gain a reaction from the text. So that is basically the reader response criticism. But reader response criticism is not a free-for-all school of thought where anything goes. So it is a disciplined theory deserving of a careful reading of the text. Critics are focused on finding meaning in the ways or in the act of reading itself, examining the ways individual readers or communities of readers experience text. The reader joins with the author to help the text meaning. So, when we say reader response approach, it is not a free verse that you can write anything you want. You still have to be focused in something. And what should we be focused on? That is to the meaning finding or finding meaning in the act of reading itself. So why are you reading? What moral lessons can you get? So did you get these certain kind of lessons? And so on and so forth. So you are going to critique a certain piece by using those questions. A successful reader response critique does not just respond to a text because anyone can do that. Again, it's not some kind of free verse, but that critic analyzes his or her response or the responses of others. Meaning to say, before you give a comment, you need to analyze your comment as well. So our life experiences and the communities we belong to greatly influence our reading of a text. So again, in the reader response, we may have different responses. We may have different relation to the text depending on our life experiences. Because each reader will interact with the text differently. The text may have more than one valid interpretation. So it has, when giving a critique to a certain text using the reader response, it will definitely have more than one interpretation because again, it depends on the different experiences of different readers. So that would be all for the reader response. So to sum it up all. So to be able to understand a literary piece using the lens of historical approach, it is important to ask the following questions. When was the work written? Again, medieval age, 10 years ago, during Spanish conquest. When was it published? So again, time, 1980s, 1800s, so on and so forth. So how did the critics and the public receive the writing? Why? So this can be two answers. So in the past, during its first debut of being published, how did the readers reacted, the critics reacted, and modern times. How did you reacted? And why? What did the story reveal about the standard and values of the time when it was published and reviewed? So, did the story show that slavery was a thing? That social racism is a thing? Or did it show that women started to have rights? And so on and so forth. So, what social attitudes and cultural practices during the time were revealed in the story? So, again, same examples, ano? So, did women were only at home doing the dishes and so on and so forth? Did they have rituals for praying and so on and so forth? What kind of relationships during that time were built in the story? So, here we need to look at the story as well. So, how much do we understand the past as reflected in the events of the story? So, how did we understand? Did we get insights? Did we get knowledge on how people think? How people, what are their traditions during that time in the story? Did we get insight? Did we get experiences? What are the differences in the time between the publication of the literary work and the present? So, comparison of the past and right now. Next is the moment the readers react to the literary piece, put themselves in the situation and make a comparison of their time, and readers' times the readers dissect, interpret, and make meaning out of the text. That is when the reader response approach takes place. So when we now give a critic on a personal level, then therefore it has become a reader response approach. So I hope you understand the lesson for today. So if you have any questions, so feel free to ask me. So that is all. Thank you and goodbye.